Eliza Townsend was the kind of woman who carried a natural grace that captivated anyone who met her. At 27, she was intelligent, compassionate, and grounded, her presence lighting up any room she entered. Though young, she had a maturity that belied her age, a trait shaped by years of hard work and humble beginnings. Her life changed dramatically when she crossed paths with Richard Stokes, a 57-year-old billionaire whose wealth was matched only by his quiet charm and deeply empathetic nature. Their meeting seemed improbable to souls from vastly different worlds, yet it unfolded like a tale of serendipity. Richard was no stranger to life's complexities. A widower who had spent years burying his grief in philanthropy and work, he had resigned himself to solitude. When he met Eliza at a charity gala, where she volunteered as part of a grassroots organization, his heart found a spark he hadn't felt in decades. Their connection was instantaneous and profound, built on shared values rather than superficial commonalities. Richard was captivated by Eliza's sincerity, while she admired his kindness and humility, qualities rarely associated with someone of his wealth. Their whirlwind romance drew the attention of many, and not all of it was kind. Whispers and speculative glances followed them wherever they went. Some dismissed their relationship as a fleeting dalliance, while others accused Eliza of being a gold digger. To the public, their age gap was scandalous. To those who truly knew them, it was inconsequential. Love, after all, does not measure in years. Their love, however, was not celebrated by all. Richard's two younger siblings, Edward and Clara Stokes, saw Eliza not as a loving partner but as a threat. Edward, sharp-tongued and ambitious, had long viewed himself as the natural heir to Richard's vast fortune. Clara, ever loyal to her brother's ambitions, shared his sentiments. Together, they had harbored dreams of inheriting the Stokes legacy once Richard's time came, since he had no child. Eliza's arrival shattered those dreams. The siblings believed Eliza was a gold digger, convinced she had charmed her way into their brother's life for selfish reasons. Her warmth, kindness, and genuine love for Richard were dismissed as an elaborate act. They saw her as a cunning intruder, poised to rob them of what they felt was rightfully theirs. While Richard and Eliza celebrated their love, Edward and Clara plotted in the shadows, their resentment growing with each passing day. When Richard and Eliza married, Edward and Clara's disdain turned into open hostility. They were polite enough in public to maintain appearances, but their icy glares and curt remarks revealed their true feelings. For them, the marriage was a betrayal and a blockade. They could not bear the thought of losing everything to a woman they barely knew, a younger woman at that. Despite their animosity, Eliza made genuine attempts to connect with Edward and Clara. She invited them to dinners, sought their advice on matters concerning the family, and extended every kindness she could think of. But her efforts were met with cold indifference, their prejudice blinding them to her sincerity. To Edward and Clara, every act of generosity was a calculated move, every smile a deception. It was during one of these strained family gatherings that the siblings began to contemplate the unthinkable. They realized that as long as Eliza remained in Richard's life, their inheritance would slip further and further away. Their resentment had festered into a dark resolve. Eliza had to be removed. The plan was simple, cruel, and meticulously crafted. At an upcoming family dinner, Edward and Clara would poison Eliza's drink. They chose a toxin that would act slowly, ensuring that no suspicion fell on them. To the outside world, her death would appear sudden and tragic, a cruel twist of fate rather than a calculated act of malice. The announcement of a family dinner to officially welcome Eliza into the Stokes family came as a pleasant surprise to Richard and Eliza. For weeks, Richard had encouraged his siblings to see beyond their prejudices and embrace the woman he loved, therefore he was very happy to hear of this. And to Eliza, it was an opportunity to bridge the divide, a chance to show Edward and Clara that her intentions were genuine and her love for Richard unshakable. The dinner was set to take place at the Grand Stokes estate, a sprawling property that echoed old-world opulence. Its vast halls and glittering chandeliers often hosted extravagant gatherings, but this dinner was designed to be more intimate. Edward and Clara, in their calculated way, ensured everything appeared perfect. To anyone looking in, it was the picture of a family attempting to mend its fractured bonds. Eliza arrived arm in arm with Richard, her face glowing with optimism. She greeted Edward and Clara with warmth, her smile genuine, her gestures inviting. Edward and Clara played their roles flawlessly. Edward, always the smooth talker, ushered Richard and Eliza into the grand dining room with a charm that masked his true feelings. Clara, reserved and quietly observant, exchanged pleasantries with an air of politeness that bordered on indifference. Beneath their polished exteriors, however, their hearts churned with dark intent. As the evening progressed, Eliza, ever the conversationalist, spoke warmly about her dreams of working alongside Richard on his philanthropic projects. She expressed her gratitude for being part of a family with such a rich legacy, and aware of how her words only deepened Edward and Clara's resentment. They listened with faint interest, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. The siblings had spent weeks planning this evening. Every detail had been scrutinized to ensure their scheme would go unnoticed. The poison, a colorless, odorless substance procured through Edward's shadowy connections, was the linchpin of their plan. Its effects were subtle, mimicking a natural illness that would slowly worsen over hours, leaving no trace of foul play. Edward carried the small vial discreetly in his pocket, his composure unshaken as he waited for the right moment. Dinner was served with practiced elegance, and wine flowed freely among the guests. At the perfect moment, Edward excused himself under the pretense of checking on the wine selection. In the privacy of the pantry, he uncorked a bottle meant specifically for Eliza. With steady hands, he tipped the poison into the decanter, swirling it until it dissolved completely. Returning to the dining room, Edward poured the tainted wine into Eliza's glass himself, masking his actions with effortless charm. Eliza, unaware of the trap being laid, accepted the gesture with a grateful nod. She took a sip, savoring the wine's rich flavor, oblivious to the deadly substance it now carried. As the evening wore on, Eliza continued to engage with Edward and Clara, her optimism undimmed by their veiled hostility. She shared stories, laughed at Richard's anecdotes, and genuinely believed she was beginning to make progress in winning them over. The siblings, meanwhile, maintained their facade, watching with a mix of satisfaction and unease as their plan unfolded. When the evening came to an end, Edward and Clara saw their guests off with the same calculated politeness they had displayed all night. Eliza, for her part, left the dinner feeling cautiously optimistic. She believed she had taken a step toward easing the tensions within the family. The night descended quietly upon the Stokes estate, but for Eliza, the weight of the evening began to settle in her chest like a growing storm. She had felt fine at the dinner, laughing and conversing with Richard's siblings, but now an gnawing unease began to take hold. She tried to brush it off as exhaustion from the long evening, the social pressures, and the weight of her own hopes to finally be accepted by Richard's family, but the discomfort persisted. As Richard guided her through the front door of their home, Eliza's hand instinctively pressed against her stomach. It was subtle at first, just a slight tightness in her abdomen, but it soon grew into a dull ache, spreading outward in slow, insidious waves. She could feel the warmth of her body waning as a cold sweat began to form on her brow. Something wasn't right. Richard, ever the attentive husband, noticed the subtle change in her demeanor. He suggested, gently, that they seek medical help, but Eliza, always the brave soul, insisted it was just a matter of needing rest. There was no reason to make a fuss. But as she moved toward the bedroom, the weight of her steps grew heavier. Each stride seemed to require more effort, her breath becoming shallow. Richard followed her into the bedroom, but before Richard could reach her, Eliza suddenly collapsed to the floor with a soft thud, her body going limp in an instant. A sense of urgency flooded Richard's veins as he scooped Eliza into his arms and rushed her to the car. His heart pounded fiercely in his chest as the distance to the nearest hospital seemed to stretch on endlessly. When they finally arrived at the emergency room, the hospital staff rushed to her and she was immediately admitted. But Richard's mind raced with confusion and fear. What had happened? How had she gone from a lively, hopeful woman to this pale, fragile form in the span of just a few hours? But no answers came quickly. He stood by her all through, but by morning she started jerking frantically. The doctors hurried Richard out of the hospital room as they tried to attend to Eliza. Richard paced the hospital room restlessly. He was so scared yet hopeful at the same time. When the doctor finally emerged from, his face was grim, his expression betraying no warmth or comfort. Richard stood up immediately, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. The doctor's words came slowly, carefully, and with an air of quiet finality. Eliza had passed away. The cause of death wasn't clear at first, but the doctor had spoken of poisoning of an unknown substance in her system that had caused her body to shut down so quickly, so violently. Richard felt as if the world around him was collapsing. Poisoning. The word echoed in his mind, but he couldn't grasp its full meaning. Eliza had been poisoned, and he had no idea how or by whom. The doctor's voice, though calm, conveyed a chilling sense of certainty. He couldn't bring himself to accept it. How could he? How could anyone? In the days following Eliza's tragic death, a sense of hollow grief enveloped the Stokes estate. The family, led by Richard's two younger siblings Edward and Clara, put on an impeccable performance of mourning. Their faces were painted with the deep sorrow of loss, their voices strained with the sorrowful tones of grief. To the outside world, it seemed as though they were the picture of devastation, standing by Richard's side in his time of need, offering their condolences with words laced with sadness. They hugged him close, whispered reassurances that time would heal his wounds, and promised to support him through the difficult months ahead. But beneath their composed exterior, a different reality simmered. It was a dark satisfaction that twisted beneath their expressions, masked behind the facades of mourning. They had executed their plan to perfection, eliminating the one obstacle standing in the way of their inheritance, and now they were free to claim what they had longed for, everything Richard had built, everything they had been waiting for. In the early days of mourning, Richard's grief was a quiet, heavy thing. He couldn't bring himself to leave their home, couldn't bear the thought of facing the world without Eliza by his side. He would sit in their empty living room, surrounded by the remnants of their life together, the photographs of their happy moments, and the quiet memories they had made. Everything seemed so meaningless now. The silence in the house felt deafening, a constant reminder of her absence. In a twist of events, Clara's guilt began to gnaw at her in ways she hadn't anticipated. At first, she tried to push it down, but as the days passed, the weight of her actions became unbearable. Everywhere she looked, both day and night, she would see Eliza's innocent smiling face. It became so bad that she couldn't function properly. It was in the midst of this inner turmoil that Clara finally broke down, and so, she made a decision: she would confess. And so, she went to the police station and confessed everything. The police wasted no time. Armed with Clara's confession, which detailed not only the events leading up to the dinner party but also the disturbing motivations that had driven the family to murder, they began their investigation. Edward got a police invitation for questioning. At first, he was acting all stubborn and untouchable. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. But after so much investigation and being confronted by evidence gotten from his sister, he knew he no longer had a hiding place. When the news got to Richard, what he felt was beyond shock. He was speechless, as he couldn't believe that the siblings whom he had loved unconditionally could kill his beloved wife so that they could inherit his property. He became even more depressed than when he initially got the news about Eliza's death. Now, all he felt was guilt because he believed that he had somehow failed to protect the love of his life from the vultures he called a family. On the day of the trial, Edward and Clara were asked to tell their part of the story. While Clara willingly talked about their part and admitted her wrongs, Edward was silent most of the time. It was clear that he was not remorseful, and if he was, it was about being caught and not about his awful actions. When it came time for the judge to issue the sentences, there was a marked difference in the way Clara and Edward were treated. Clara, having come forward and confessed her involvement, was given a somewhat lighter sentence. The judge acknowledged the fact that her confession had been a step towards accountability, and though the crime she had committed was heinous, her willingness to face the truth was taken into consideration. Clara was sentenced to 25 years in prison for her role in Eliza's murder. The sentence was harsh, but there was a sense of justice in it. as the judge recognized that Clara had been at least partially remorseful for her actions. Edward, however, was given a much harsher sentence. His refusal to fully confess, his arrogance throughout the trial, and his cold calculation in orchestrating the murder of his brother's wife did not sit well with the court. The judge emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime and the cruelty with which it had been carried out. Edward's sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reactions to the sentences were mixed. Some in the courtroom felt that justice had been served, though it could never truly undo the pain that had been inflicted. Others, particularly those who had known Richard and Eliza, were left with a deep sense of sadness. The Stokes family, once powerful and respected, was now a family fractured beyond repair. Richard's trust had been betrayed, his love for his wife had been shattered, and his own flesh and blood were now the ones who had caused him the greatest heartache. Richard found a way to move on by starting a foundation in Eliza's name. The foundation was dedicated to doing all the things that Eliza loved, which was helping the poor and needy. Eliza might be dead, but she will forever remain alive in Richard's heart. And so, the story of the Stokes family concluded not with a reunion, not with forgiveness, but with the quiet reflection of what greed, love, and betrayal had cost them all. It was a somber reminder that even the wealthiest and most powerful families are not immune to the darkness within. What lessons do you think society can learn from this case? Share your thoughts below. If you found this story compelling, please consider sharing it to spread awareness. Like this video, subscribe to uncover more true crime stories where deception and truth collide. Click here to watch another chilling case in our series.